Peggy, can you perhaps tell me how you got into the field of migration studies?
Well, when I was in graduate school, I was hired to work on a project about ethnic entrepreneurship. And I was asked to do the Latino community. And so I thought that I would be interviewing mostly people from Puerto Rico. And it turned out that they were all from the Dominican Republic. And in fact, they were all from this one town called Bani. And so I was really fascinated as I became sort of used to looking at the signs that would indicate this to me on the street, at how this community was sort of living its life across space between Boston and between the Dominican Republic. And so when I was looking for a dissertation topic, I thought, I need to study this transnational community. Yeah. So that's how it all began.
But at the time, did the sort of concept transnational community already exist? Or was it something that wasn't still there?
People were starting to talk about this. So this was around the time that Nina Glick-Schiller and her colleagues wrote the Nations Unbound book, but it was still a very, not a very conventional way to look at migration experiences, and I would say that in some quarters it's still not a conventional way to look at it. So,
isn't it somehow amazing, because now I think the concept of transnationalism, transnational communities, the notion that people do not just live and experience things in one place but at different places at the same time. I think you've called this simultaneity as well, this idea. But how do you explain that at a time it was such a novel concept? Because it's very difficult to imagine that now, I think.
Well, I think that countries really, and I've been thinking about this a lot, here having just come from Austria and now being here, countries really have diversity management regimes that are really influence how they talk about diversity, how they manage diversity, how they see diversity. And whether we want to admit it or not, it influences how our scholarship gets structured, how the categories we use and how we organize that scholarship. So you see certain things, you don't see other things. And you see the things that you see through a certain lens. And so, first of all, it's hard for people to let go of the idea that the nation state is the logical, automatic organizer of social life. And then second of all, when you do, you do that in the context of lots of experience of migration, being in a country where immigration is a normal thing versus immigration's been happening for a long time, but you sort of don't want to admit it to yourself, versus, you know, yes, these people are here, but we're never going to make them part of us. And so I think all of those deep cultural structures and those management regimes and conceptual tools really influence how we get to talk about these things or not.
So when you and other scholars start to write more and more about this transnationalism concept and try to apply it in your own research, to interpret also your research, did you find a lot of resistance in the beginning? Or was it in the concept that was very much welcome?
No, absolutely. There was a lot of resistance, and I think there still is. Not to accepting that that's a reality, but so I don't use the term transnationalism. I think of transnational as an adjective, not a noun. This is how my thinking has evolved. So I use it as an optic or a lens with which to ask questions. So in other words, whatever I'm interested in, I don't assume the appropriate spatial unit of analysis. I'd say, what's the space and what are the layers of social experience that I need to take into account to answer this particular question? And so, so even if people acknowledge that the people that they're interested in socially including or excluding or integrating or assimilating have homeland ties, some are still focused on that integration experience or that receiving country experience and really don't take seriously the need to ask, at least consider how that is influenced by that. In other words, that you can't understand integration or assimilation without at least saying, what does it have to do with a homeland experience? And that's, that's also about our different career paths and what conversations we started being part of. But I really think it's short-sighted. Not to say that everything is transnational, but that if you don't ask that broader question, you're likely to miss out on a lot of important factors.
Because it's what some criticizers would say, that of course the nation still matters, and we shouldn't sort of dismiss that the whole critique on methodological nationalism.
Of course the nation still matters, and nobody's saying that it doesn't, and nobody's saying that this is entirely new. We're saying that this is qualitatively different than it was in the past, and in fact the most interesting things are to look at how the nation and the global and the city and the local are implicated together. And that's what a transnational optic does. It tries to hold those layers of experience in conversation with each other and see how they mutually inform each other.
So this refusal to sort of adopt this empirical observation of transnational lives, transnational attitudes, do you explain this, as some have done, by the policy-dependent nature of a lot of migration research, or is there something else going on?
Well, I think that's part of it, and I think one of the areas that we're starting to develop as part of the Transnational Studies Initiative, which I co-direct at Harvard, is this idea of global social protection. So that first of all, what kinds of conversations do you need to have if people construct health and education and the ability to retire across borders, then how do you have a different conversation about a different kind of nation state, and what kinds of policies and institutions do you need to put in place to respond to that reality? So if you're always focused on what's the policy for integration, you're going to miss the fact that, well, what about those people? What about if we take mobility as the starting point and realize that people are raising families and earning their livelihoods in this transnational social field, and that we need to do social protection and provision in a mobile way and new kinds of institutions. So I think that's part of it for sure.
Is there, do you find there is increasing openness from the policy side? Because if I look at the European picture, there's often this assumption that transnationalism or transnational lives somehow are opposed to this idea of integration. That there's sort of backlash against double citizenship in some European countries.
Right.
Sort of re-emphasizing assimilation, a sort of backlash against multiculturalism. So from that perspective, the debate seems to be going in a very different direction.
Well, I think you sort of have two parallel trends, because you're right, that's absolutely true, even though several studies have shown that, the more integrated people are, they're the ones who are more likely to be engaged in their home. Right, yeah. It's the policy assumption. But at the same time, I think that the European context is kind of the precursor to thinking about global social protection, because here you do have portability of benefits to a certain, now it's not ironed out, there are lots of bumps in the road, right? But at least there's this discussion about, okay, people are going to this is a mobile labor market, then what do you do about your pension? You collect your pension in one place, but I don't actually know how it works, but there's some kind of evening out in the end, right? And some central function that makes sure every country gets what it's supposed to get, and people get what they're supposed to get. This health card, this European health card, I'm sure that's a difficult one to work out too, but that sets a precedent for a different kind of providing and protecting. And what's interesting is that you need to ask that question in a European context. So in other words, in a regional context. So that's what it looks like in Europe. What does this look like in the context of the ASEAN countries, or the southern cone of Latin America, or the Andean Parliament, or something like that?
So you think there is a growing support for this idea of global social protection?
I wouldn't want to say, well, I would hope there would be, but all I would venture to say is that it's a really important new set of questions that we need to be asking as migration scholars.
Yeah, but there's still a lot of resistance. you think?
Yes,
Yeah.
I do.
Yeah.
I do.
In 1998, I think you published your article on social remittances. Can you perhaps tell a little bit more about why you came up with that concept and why you thought it was necessary to develop it?
Sure. Well, at that point, I was writing in response to what I thought of as the over-economization of the migration field. So lots of emphasis on how much money was being circulated between migrants and non-migrants, but nothing about the ideas and the practices and the skills and know-how that was also circulating. And so I was really trying to call attention to that. Recently, I'm working with a doctoral student at MIT, Deepak Lanba-Nieves, who's actually gone back to the village where I did my original fieldwork. So it's almost 25 years of fieldwork in the same place in the Dominican Republic. And so we sort of revisited the social remittances concept, trying to add a corrective into the debate about, that this is not, we really wanted to stress it's circular, not one way, not going from receiving country to sending country, that these are not all positive inputs by any means, and that they're collective as well as individual, and that they scale up and scale out. So by that we meant that, say you adapt a different way of doing a project, a local health project, you'll scale out to other domains of practice like education or infrastructure project, and you'll scale up to expecting accountability and transparency at a local level to a provincial level of governance, you'll hold your national level leaders also accountable. But for me, this is all part of a kind of trying to bring culture back in seriously to the migration debate, that that not just looking at, I've been talking about this as the relationship between migrating people and migrating culture, and sort of how does migration enable that migration of culture? How does culture change? And then how does that cultural change enable more migration? And so another project that I'm working on now is about museums. And because when you talk about the resistance to new kinds of policy initiatives or new thinking about where policy should be made and in what kinds of institutional arenas, you have to have a different kind of vocabulary. You have to have a different kind of way of imagining the nation. So where do those cultural building blocks come from? And museums, because they've been so important in creating citizens in the past, it's interesting to look at what role they're playing in creating both diverse, multicultural societies, but also to what extent do they create global citizens or cosmopolitan competencies? This, either the ethos of feeling part of the world, the practices and skills that you need to feel part of the world, or cosmopolitics, actually a cosmopolitan project, which would be global social protection as an example.
Do you have already a sort of tentative answer to that question, what role museums now play in sort of construction of these new identities?
I do. The project is about 2 sets of museums in 3 different settings. So it's Sweden and Denmark, Boston and New York, and Singapore and Doha. And there are a lot of reasons why museums don't or do that in all of those places. But I think 3 reasons that distinguish them are the what I call the city's cultural armature, or sort of the deep cultural structures in a city, its history, its demography, its policies, the demography and the diversity management regimes to manage that demography, but also sort of where a city and a country see itself in the arc of their empire. So how they're using cultural institutions in their nation building project and in their sort of world claiming project. So all of the museums are they all do the global and the national at the same time, but it's sort of a continuum of cosmopolitan nationalism. Some are very nationalistic and only using the referencing the globe to reassert the nation, like Denmark, for example, and then some are really cosmopolitan because they believe that the nation, that it's a good thing in itself to be a global citizen, and then you also build a stronger nation. So an example of that is Sweden, museums in Sweden.
To get back to the concept of social remittances, which you coined, became hugely popular in the literature. Do you think it has been interpreted in the right way, or have there been sort of misinterpretations that have multiplied themselves in literature?
Do you have an idea that you're thinking of?
No, I often refer to social remittances almost casually.
Yeah.
Sort of we have financial remittances and we have social remittances,
Right.
which sort of is often very much in this migration and development debate.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of scholars, which I think is a good thing, want to show awareness, and I think your work has been very important in saying it's not just about money, it's about other things. But I was just wondering, when you read this more general literature, which is not so much in practically your discipline or your field, that sort of other scholars use your work. Do you think, I mean, I'm sure that sometimes you may wonder how well is my work being read, or how well is the concept being picked up?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think that's just a problem with social remittances. I think it's a problem with transnational too.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the problem, that people can easily dismiss it because they say this is everywhere and it's being used gratuitously.
Yeah.
And I think there's some truth to that, because transnational is not just about like, oh yeah, the homeland. It's about simultaneity. It's about looking at those multiple places, not just sending or receiving, but all the places that are salient for a particular individual or a particular institution, and seeing how they are mutually informing each other. So there are lots of gratuitous, let me just put in the home country for a second and then I'll call it a transnational project. Or let me just talk about ideas circulating. But I would hope that when you put these ideas out there, then people actually use them empirically and refine them. I mean, that's the whole idea.
But you just alluded to this idea that perhaps your concept has been too much interpreted as one-way traffic from the global north to the global south.
Right, which is a dangerous thing. Also to think that all of these things are positive, because they're not. And the migration, you know this better than I do. The migration development literature and all of those debates have a real tendency to kind of put the responsibility for development on the backs of migrants. And if social remittances or discussions about economic remittances are contributing to that debate, I'm sorry about that.
To me, it still reflects some Western arrogance or even colonial thinking that all the goods comes from the West, and
Absolutely.
you have to come to the West not just to save money and invest it, but also this sort of values and knowledge, and you sprinkle that gold dust once you're back in your country. This is often the sort of hidden assumption in that debate.
Right.
Do you also recognize that in the way the sort of social remittances are being?
Absolutely, absolutely, and that was why in this Social Remittances Revisited article with Deepak, we were very clear about how we wanted to make the argument that what people bring with them really influences what they contribute to the places that they're moving to, what they get exposed to there, then that kind of package that they end up sending back, and then that recirculation of ideas. So just to give you a concrete example, in this community, there's a long, long tradition of community activism and, political engagement. People say they're born with the PRD or the PLD, the political parties, in their genes. They also have these, traditions of convites, which are my onions need to be harvested today, I'll help you, then you help me the next day. So lots of, tradition of communal responsibility and understanding that that's what we should do. So they got to Boston, and it wasn't, it's no surprise that they would reorganize themselves and do things together, and that predicated what they came into contact with in Boston and then what they sent back, and then this continuous circulation. So absolutely, you're right that that's a big weakness in the literature, and I hope people pay attention to that.
Yeah. Last topic, this whole migration development debate, how it has evolved over the last 10 to 15 years. We had this euphoria around remittances about 10, 12, 13 years ago. And you've been an observer of that debate as well, so how do you think it has evolved, and what do you think the future holds for that debate, or where it should be going, perhaps?
I sometimes feel, to be perfectly honest, discouraged, because I feel that the same questions are being asked over and over again. That's not to say that there's not great work. I mean, I think the kind of work that you all are doing here is very, very important in really looking closely at specific questions and moving that forward. But for me, the role that I'm trying to play in the debate is to say, these other questions matter. Culture matters in this. Let's take it seriously and integrate it seriously. Let's really look at this transnational lens and think about global social protection. So old questions need to be asked in more careful ways so we get better answers based on what we already know, but new questions have to be asked.
Isn't that sort of question being swept off the table often? It's always about investment and growth, and the whole issues around inequality, social security are somehow not playing a very important role. Also, if you see how the debate is evolving in Europe, because I think there has been a real change in terms of, you don't find many nations that say we are not immigration countries, but the new sort of ideology is really about migration for growth.
Right, well, because we're living in this neoliberal age and an age of economic crisis and precarious employment, and so all of these debates are taking place with that sort of ethos permeating, and then it shifts it. It really does. It shifted to marketization and privatization, and so that, in a sense, is what's different, because at least before there might have been some sense of a stronger social welfare contract between state and citizen.
But now with the sort of increasing attention on inequality of the last year, also under influence of Thomas Piketty's work and the whole debate that has stirred up, isn't that also providing a sort of opportunity to sort of make more connections between broader debates about inequality and social justice and this debate about how do we treat migrants?
I think that would be wonderful, and I think that, part of thinking about global social protection is understanding that class and inequality and gender discrimination, for example, are created across boundaries, and so then you have to be able to address them across borders as well. So,
thank you.
Thank you.